Hey, good morning. This is Captain Roger of the Grass Valley Corps of the Salvation Army, and it is Resurrection Sunday. He is risen. Jesus is risen indeed. Now, Jesus is alive, or so I believe, and if you come and join our in-person gathering on Sunday morning at 11, I am going to share some of the reasons that I believe Jesus is alive and what I think that means, and we're going to have an opportunity for others to share what they think and what it means to them. We might even eat some jelly beans, but no promises. But for today, grace and peace to you all. We are studying Matthew's story of Jesus as told in the first gospel, the first book of what we refer to as the New Testament in the Bible. And Matthew is giving us evidence for who it is that he believes Jesus to be by laying out stories of things that Jesus did and the people who saw those things. Matthew was, at this point, he was giving us a list of witnesses who could speak to the truth of what it was that he was saying. And first, he gave us 3 examples of Jesus dealing with sickness and how people responded. And he linked that to prophecies in Hebrew scripture that show that who and what the promised Messiah was going to be, so that Matthew could say, look, Jesus was the promised Messiah, and here is why. And next, after that, he's telling stories about Jesus' power over the natural and the supernatural, and even over the idea of sin, authority that is God's authority and God's alone. And people responded to those things that Jesus was doing by flocking to him on their own and when he called them. And while some questioned the quality and behavior of those people and of Jesus himself, Jesus told them that he wasn't trying to change them, but that new people needed new ways, and that allowing this brought more people to God. Ooh, there's a dangerous thought in the church in the modern world, isn't there? How much more dangerous do you suppose it was in Jesus' day? Now, we're going to get into a third set of 3 witnesses here. In fact, Matthew's going to sneak an extra one in for us here in his stories. All 3 of these stories he's about to tell talk about the authority of Jesus to change lives, or more specifically, in these cases, his authority gives life and restores those who accept him. So we're going to start today in Matthew chapter 9, right at verse 18. I'm going to give you just a quick second to find that. Matthew 9, verses 18 and 19. Well, Jesus was saying this. That's referring to the stuff that came before, the stuff we talked about last week. You can go look that up for yourself. Well, Jesus was saying this. The synagogue leader came and knelt before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her and she will live." And Jesus got up and went with him, and so did his disciples. Now, synagogue leader. This is someone in a Jewish community who was essentially in charge of the local place of worship. It was someone who was there to help people connect to God when they were away from the temple. Now, the temple was the central place, but a synagogue was a local place of learning. Sometimes it did the basic schooling for the kids and their early education. But this was someone who would have been deeply connected to the religious traditions of the time. So for him to be coming to Jesus to ask for healing for his daughter tells you one of 2 things. One, he recognized who Jesus was based on the things he was doing, or his daughter had just died and he was desperate for anything that might bring her back, right? And I'm not saying that it couldn't have been both of those things, but those are the 2 motivations that I see would drive someone like this to Jesus at this time. And what we see in him coming to Jesus, though, is this faith, this belief that Jesus is going to be able to do something, and his action in going to him and saying, "Please come do something." But this is come put your hand on her and she will live. What a statement of faith that is. Because what had anyone done or said that would lead him to believe that kind of thing. And Jesus' response astounds me, because he just goes. Matthew doesn't record any statements from him or the disciples. It's like the guy went up and comes and says, "Hey, my daughter's died. Please come put your hand on her and she'll live." And Jesus just like, no words. He just goes. Now, Luke tells exactly the same story in his biography of Jesus, but he has some different elements that he puts in. Why does he have a different type of story than Matthew does? Well, it's because Luke is trying to make a different point in the story that he's telling here. Matthew is trying to focus on people's response to Jesus. That's what Matthew wants us to see. He wants us to hear and know about people's response to Jesus. In the case of the synagogue leader, he really wants us to know about this man's faith in Jesus. And to keep anyone from missing that, he uses this example because there's like a bonus story inside of this story that also speaks to faith. Look at verse 20. Just then, a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. And she said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I'll be healed." Jesus turned and saw her and said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has healed you." And the woman was healed at that moment. Now, bleeding for 12 years, that sounds bad, doesn't it? Nowadays, we might call this like an interuterine disorder. Essentially, she's been menstruating continually for 12 years. And in their culture, under the rules of the Mosaic covenant, that made her ritually unclean. She didn't belong in a crowd of people because she would have been seen as contaminating them all with her presence and any touch. Matthew doesn't call this out. Luke makes this a little more clear, but Matthew doesn't call this out. Why not? Because it's not his point. His point is he wants us to hear what she thought and what Jesus said. What she thought is, if I could only even just touch him, I'll be healed. And what Jesus said is, your faith has healed you. See, here again, faith is being shown as having two parts. There's belief and there's action. Belief and action. That makes up faith. The woman's belief was that Jesus could heal her if only she even touched him. Her action was to take herself out, put herself through this crowd that she shouldn't have been in, find a way to Jesus and touch him so that she could be healed. The synagogue's leader belief was that Jesus could somehow bring life back to his lifeless daughter, back to this poor girl who had just died. His belief is that Jesus could fix even this. And his action was to go to where Jesus was, to get him and say, "I need you to come and put your hands on my daughter so that she will live." Right? Is that crazy? Maybe it is. Let's go on in the story. Verse 23. When Jesus entered the synagogue leader's house. You know what? I completely skipped over something that's probably kind of important. You caught that bit at the end. The woman was healed at the moment that Jesus said, "Your faith has healed you." Yeah. Matthew doesn't make a big deal about it, and so I just skimmed over it just like most of us do when we read it, because we're trying to get onto the exciting part of the story, but that's pretty exciting. I mean, chronic illness to be dealt with like that, that's amazing. Hold that in the back of your head. Let's go back to verse 23. When Jesus entered the synagogue leader's house and saw the noisy crowd and people playing pipes, he said, "Go away, the girl's not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. Now, it was noisy and there were pipes because people were mourning. This is what they did in mourning. There's keening and wailing and crying, and it was out loud. It was exhibited out loud. And pipes, there would have been people who both in small towns, small communities, there would have been people who were good at playing like a funeral pipe or dirge or whatever, and they would come out when they heard someone had passed, and they would play out of respect for the family, and so that everyone could hear, oh my goodness, someone in this household has died. And there were professional mourners too. And for a respected family, like a synagogue leader's family, everyone turns out. Even the professionals, they'd be there to make sure that everyone is aware that someone has died and that people should respond appropriately. Now, Jesus comes and tells them to go away. Get out. She's not dead. She's just asleep. And they laughed at him. Well, why would they laugh at him? Well, they laughed at him because she was dead. I mean, it's easy to criticize them, but here's the basic fact is she's dead. She is dead. And Jesus is saying, oh, no, she's just sleeping. What the heck is he talking about? And they laughed at him. They mocked him. I want to criticize them for being faithless, but I can't say that I would do anything different because she's dead. And when someone is dead and you can see them dead and know that they're dead, if someone comes along and says, oh yeah, they're not dead, you know what? It's laughable. But Jesus has them sent out of the house. And the synagogue leader is like, all right, Jesus said, get out, you guys, get out, get out, get out. And then verse 25 tells us that after the crowd had been put outside, Jesus went in, he took the girl by the hand, and she got up. Again, you can go read this in Luke's version. It's got more details, but Matthew wants us to know Jesus took her by the hand, and she got up. She was dead, and now she's not dead. What was different? Jesus reached out his hand, and he touched her exactly the way the synagogue leader told him he would. Just come lay your hand on my daughter and she'll live. Verse 26 says, news of this spread through all that region. Yeah, I bet it did. Now, both of these stories, the healing of the woman with the bleeding and the resurrection of this dead girl, both of these stories have layers that people don't usually think about. Because this is not just healing the physical. Jesus met the Father in this sharp, immediate pain of his loss, and he met him in the way that the man needed. He didn't talk to him. He didn't talk about his faith. He didn't talk about anything. The man came and said, come lay your hand on my daughter who just died. And Jesus is like, I'm going. He was willing to walk with that man in the pain of his loss. And meeting this woman along the way who is in constant pain and isolation because of her chronic disease, frankly, in both of these cases, the physical healing, as important as the physical healing was, it may not have been as important as Jesus being there to hear about their pain and to respond with compassion instead of rejection, with caring instead of false sympathy, with presence instead of reconciling instead of recoiling from their grief, like somehow their individual problems were going to just leap out and infect people around them. But that's the way people tend to deal with other people's pain. They're like, oh, hands off. Someone's mourning. Let's say something that's going to make them feel better. Hey, sure, your daughter died, but she's in heaven. God needed another angel. Isn't that great? No, it's not. She's dead. It sucks. Jesus just walked with that man in his pain. Jesus just saw that woman in her chronic illness and her chronic pain. He said, your faith has healed you. That's what mattered. It's not that the healings weren't awesome, especially bringing a dead girl back to life. I mean, that is amazing. That is a miracle way beyond healing. But what would you think? How do you think those skeptics who'd been ushered out responded to the news? Or how they responded to this walking, talking, breathing presence of this girl that they had seen dead? We were told the news spread through the whole region. Well, the news spread. Of course it did. That's amazing. That's something that's newsworthy. But did faith go with the news? Well, it did for some, anyway. Look at verse 27. Jesus went on from there, and 2 blind men followed him, calling out, have mercy on us, Son of David. Son of David? That's a messianic title. They have made the leap, at least intellectually, they have made this leap that Jesus must be someone more than he seemed to be. And they're out there in public, in the crowd, calling out, "Son of David, have mercy." You're giving him this messianic title. And what Jesus does next tells us something about Jesus, something more about Jesus than about the men. Verse 28 says, when he had gone indoors, now don't miss this, from being in a crowd with these two men declaring him to be the Messiah, Son of David, have mercy on us, Jesus turns and he goes into a private home. He gets out of the public eye. When he had gone indoors, the blind men came to him and he asked them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" "Yes, Lord," they replied. Then he touched their eyes and he said, "According to your faith, let it be done to you." And their sight was restored. And Jesus warned them sternly, "See that no one knows about this." See, he's not in it for the publicity. All the healing and all the things that drew people in, Jesus wasn't in it for the fame or the fortune or any of that. He was here for a purpose. He wanted to teach people how to walk with God. That's everything he did, was about how do we walk with God? How do we walk with one another in community? Because that's what God tried to set up. And how do we walk with God? What do we do for each other? In Isaiah chapter 42, verses 1 through 4, God talks about the upcoming Messiah. He says, "Here is my servant whom apparently my batteries in my speaking voice need to be recharged. Let's try this again. The word of God, Isaiah 42, verses 1 through 4. "Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged until he establishes justice on the earth. In his teaching the islands will put their hope." Now, justice. You got to talk about this word justice because it doesn't mean what we generally think of it meaning. Justice is not redemptive violence. That's what our culture tends to put on that word. We say justice, and what we usually mean is I'm going to hurt someone because they hurt someone, right? Oh, that person hurt that person this much, so we're going to hurt them that much. That is not justice, at least not biblically. Biblical justice is all about restoration and wholeness. It's about putting things back together. In fact, in biblical justice, the idea is that everything is restored. Relationship is restored. The community is restored by the actions taken to bring about justice. Wholeness is achieved. If someone steals something from you, there was a penalty that they needed to pay. And when that penalty was paid, they were supposed to be restored to community. You wouldn't be like, well, there's the guy who stole stuff from me. You would be, hello, neighbor. How are you? Because that's been fixed. It's been repaired. It's been restored. It is back to what it should have been. That is justice. That's a hard leap to make from our mindset of let me hurt you because you hurt me, right? But that is biblical justice. It's about restoration. God says, hey, I'm not sending the Messiah to make a big deal out of himself. I'm not sending the Messiah to bring extra glory to me. You know what? God's got glory. He's got his own glory. He created the universe, for heaven's sake. He's got enough glory. He says, I'm sending the Messiah to bring restoration, to bring justice. And he goes on to say that that restoration is going to come from faithfulness. These men, these blind men, they realized who Jesus must be, and they asked him to restore their sight. They believed and they acted. And Jesus saw their faith and restored them. And then he tells them, hey, look, keep it on the down low. All right, guys, say, we don't need to make a big deal out of this. I hear that you recognize who I am, but let's just keep it quiet, okay? Do they listen to him? Verse 31, but they went out and spread the news about him all over that region. Yeah, of course they didn't listen. Who's going to listen? I've been blind for years, and all of a sudden I can see. Everyone's going to know about that. They're so excited. They are restored. They are healed. But that wasn't the point that Jesus was trying to live out. It's not the point Matthew's trying to make either. He's just trying to make the point that the response of these men to Jesus was to have faith, to believe in him, and to act on their belief. Verse 32 says, while they were going out, a man who was demon-possessed and could not talk was brought to Jesus. And when the demon was driven out, the man who had been mute spoke. And the crowd was amazed and said, nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel. But, oh man, you'd think that would be enough right there. Wow, this is amazing. But there's always a but, isn't there? In this case, the but is the Pharisees, and they are a big but. Verse 34, but the Pharisees said, it is by the prince of demons that he drives out demons. By the prince of demons. You know what people are really bad at? We're really bad at changing our minds. Once we've decided something is true, be it a political position or a religious belief, even if we are shown a pile of evidence that we are wrong, we tend to dig in and insist that we're right and start to come up with alternative explanations, sometimes crazy ones, to say that we're still right. There are a whole bunch of technical names for this effect, but my favorite comes from a book called The Enigma of Reason. They call it the my side bias. In short, once we've made our minds up about something, we're not willing to do the mental work to change, even if it's obvious that we're wrong. So we just block out anything from the other side. It's just my side. Anything that contradicts our ideas, no, that can't possibly be, because my side believes in this. It's a my side bias. Pharisees have decided that Jesus is trouble. I mean, he's tweaked them and their ideas dozens of times already. And so they have decided, man, Jesus, he is trouble. Rather than reevaluate their position, they're just going to, man, Jesus, I don't know about that guy. Obviously, his restoring people to wholeness and health is some kind of a demonic activity. Faced with his evidence that Jesus has healed all kinds of illness and demonstrated power over the natural and supernatural and shown himself to be even a master over death, this group of people, or at least this segment of them, have decided that what makes the most sense to them is this person who's doing all this good is obviously a servant of Satan. He's evil incarnate. But matters of faith, like matters of politics, they're about the folks in the middle. They're really about the people who haven't made their decision yet. I used to be involved in party politics, and when I was, we were aware of the fact in our campaigning that there were 20% of the people who were firmly on one side and 20% of the people who were firmly on the other side, and then in between were these 60% who hadn't really made up their minds one way or the other. Those were the people that we tried to sway, because this 20% is never going to convince this 20% of anything, and this 20% is never going to convince this 20% of anything, because they've all made up their minds. And they are not going to move regardless of what evidence is shown to them, unless it is something very extreme that affects them. Verse 35 says, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless. They were like sheep without a shepherd. And then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. How many of you out there have ever felt harassed or helpless? Yeah, my hand's up too. Yeah. Remember that the point Matthew is making is about faith and fellowship. What do you believe and what will you do about it? That's faith. And what is the response Jesus demonstrates? Because that compassion, the caring, the coming alongside someone facing pain or loss or illness or whatever, that's Jesus being there, reaching out, offering a hand to those in need. That is fellowship. It's an offer of fellowship, of kinship, of togetherness, of community, of family. The person that hand is offered to, they can accept it or they can slap it away. It's either going to be, thank you so much for binding up my wounds and restoring me. Thank you for bringing me justice. Or it's going to be, don't touch me. Just leave me here in the pit that I'm wallowing in. It always falls on one side or the other. Psalm chapter 40 says, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire, and he set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God, and many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in him. And you know what? That's great. The psalmist is talking about how God lifted him out of this difficult spot. God was with him. God pulled him out of the mud and stood him up on a rock. There's a lot of people God will pull out of the mud and put on a rock, and they'll be like, God didn't do that. I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps. Well, you know what? You got to look for the bigger picture. You got to understand that the world may not center on you or me, but there is still an aspect, God's aspect in creation, that cares about us and reaches out to us and tries to bring every one of us to a new place, a better position, out of the mud, on solid ground. And when Jesus tells his followers to ask God to send out workers, hopefully it will inspire them to stand up and say, here I am, Lord, send me. Let me be the one to help pull people out of the mud. Let me be the one to rescue people who are drowning. And when he calls to those who are not his followers, hopefully they will allow themselves to trust their lives to him, both their beliefs and their actions. Please, please, when Jesus calls you, trust him, listen to him. I had a relative pass away a few years back, and before they passed, one of the things I said to them is, when Jesus calls you, go to him. And said, I know that you haven't known him much in your life, but go to him. You could tell him, I didn't know you, but I knew this guy who told me that I need to go to you. Just believe and act on that belief. I think that is something we all need to do when Jesus calls us in this life. In this life, when Jesus calls us, trust, go, believe, and act. Through faith, the blind were restored. Through faith, the dead was given new life. And where there are those who refuse to believe, where there are those who make themselves blind, who would rather be dead than raised, who would look at restoration and accuse the restorer of being evil, I hope that even those people will allow themselves to be open to the possibility that they may be wrong. In the end, Jesus won over many of those who had cursed him. The evidence in his favor was overwhelming, especially after he'd been killed and then walked out of that tomb 3 days later. Even then, many refused to believe, but the evidence was and is there for those who will examine it honestly. Jesus is alive, and you can choose. You can choose to believe and choose to act on that belief, like those who were restored and then spread the good news to the world. There's a big harvest out there, and it's waiting for you. It's waiting for me. It's people who are in need, people who need someone to be community with them, to be their family, to reach out. If you have difficulty believing that Jesus could be alive, because someone who's dead doesn't come back. You know what? Come and join us and talk about it. Ask me questions here. Put a question in the comments. Put a question in email. Send it to me. Whatever. I will be happy to tell you why I think such a crazy thing is true. And then you will have to choose what you believe. But please know, even if you've chosen not to believe, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't reevaluate the evidence. Even if you've chosen to believe, it doesn't mean you shouldn't reevaluate the evidence. Please continue to evaluate. Test everything. That's what we are taught in Scripture. Faith is never supposed to be blind. Faith is always about, let me try this out. It's like lifting weights. Your faith gets built up over time as you lift heavier and heavier weights. The challenge is there's always a heavier weight that needs to be lifted. An opportunity where doubt or questions feel like they're crushing until you actually learn enough to lift yourself out of them. Until you grow more muscles, as it were. Until your faith grows stronger and leads you to that next step. And faith is about belief and action. It's not about closing your eyes and stepping off the edge of a cliff and hoping that someone's going to catch you. It is about testing everything God sends you and seeing that He is true in all things. Test the idea that Jesus came back from the dead. It's Resurrection Sunday today when I'm speaking to you. When I'm recording this, it is Easter. It is the day of the empty tomb. It is the day that no one expected, and yet everyone has benefited from. There's a big harvest out there waiting for you to put your faith in Jesus and then to act on that belief that He is who and what He said He is, because that action means you get to become who and what He said you could be. And you can go out and become part of the solution rather than continuing to be part of the problem. Are you with me? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Let's close in prayer this morning. Father, thank you so much for Jesus. Thank you for His presence. Thank you for His actions. And thank you for His teaching in this world. Thank you for the ways that He has shown each and every one of us how it is that we can grow closer to you by living out your instructions for our lives. God, I recognize that the instructions you give are sometimes vague, and you leave it to us to wrestle through what it means. I mean, what is love your neighbor? How do we do that? There's 1,000 different neighbors. There's 1,000 different ways we need to do it. And yet you gave us the mental hardware to work through these things. You gave us the ability to think and to decide how best to pursue the goals that you set up for us. Lord, I just pray that every one of us looks at those goals, recognizes their value, and strives for them as best we can, just the way Jesus showed us to. All those years ago, He walked out of that tomb alive, the master of death, the master of life, just as He had shown us He could be in times where He healed people, where He restored bodies, where He even restored life to the lifeless. God, thank you for the witnesses that you provided to the power that Jesus had. Thank you for the witness Jesus provided to the power of you, God, of you in our world, in our life. And I just pray that you will help each and every one of us to have the faith to test the beliefs that you will do what you say, so that we can see that acting is worth it. Drive our lives, Lord. Thank you again for all the blessings that you pour out in each of our lives. Keep our minds open and our hearts willing to test new knowledge at all times. Pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Hey, wherever you're going this week, remember, there's nothing to fear because God is already there. Just go with God. Grace and peace to each and every one of you today.